Pine Gap. We look at the secretive base in the Northern Territory, what we know about it and what goes on there, from the drone wars to mass surveillance, coming up on the show. From Melbourne, you're watching The World from Below. I'm Lizzie O'Shea. Tonight we have a special episode of The World from Below where we are joined by Professor Richard Tanter and Emily Howie. Professor Richard Tanter is a Senior Research Associate at the Nautilus Institute and a Professor at the School of Political and Social Studies at the University of Melbourne. Richard has worked on peace, security and environment issues in East and Southeast Asia and as an analyst, policy advocate and activist since the 1970s. And with the Nautilus Institute, he works on projects relating to global security, sustainability and problem solving. Emily Howie is Director of Advocacy and Research at the Australian Human Rights Law Centre. She has worked with the HRLC since 2009, where she focuses on accountability for Australia's actions overseas. This includes consideration of human rights protections in Australia's foreign policy, border protection and military cooperation, including Australia's involvement in the US drone program. We start today's program by looking at Pine Gap. Pine Gap is a satellite tracking station 20 kilometres southwest of Alice Springs. It is run by Australia and the United States, and it is involved in operations with the CIA and the NSA. Last year, Australian media reported that Pine Gap may be a critical component of the US drone program, which has killed thousands of civilians in a number of countries, including Pakistan, Yemen and Somalia. According to documents revealed by Edward Snowden, Pine Gap also plays a key role in surveillance programs, including the NSA's PRISM program. Tell us, Richard, what do we know about Pine Gap and what goes on there?
Well, according to the Australian government, we don't know very much, but in fact we do know quite a lot because the US government's a bit more forthcoming. The best way to explain its two quite different functions is actually to think about something far away, the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine. The United States government maintained that it was shot down by a Russian-supplied ground-wear missile. They claim to know this from two ways, both of which relate to the system of which Pine Gap is part. In one hand, they're thermal imaging satellites, they're huge infrared telescopes basically, sitting in the sky high above, in this case, Ukraine, observe the thermal bloom, the heat released from the launch of the missile. They then tracked its trajectory. The second thing that those other satellites from the United States runs also picked up the radar transmissions that were targeting the plane. And those satellites, there are about 3 in each case, the thermal imaging ones and the signals intelligence ones as they're called, sit above the Earth, and Pine Gap is one of 3 critical ground stations for both the thermal imaging infrared satellites and for the signals intelligence ones, which pick up a huge range of electronic transmissions, radar in this case, mobile telephones in the case of drone strikes. It's an extraordinarily important American facility in Australia.
And that information would be shared. It's not something that Australia just keeps to itself, presumably with the United States and other countries?
I think the question is the other way around. How much does the United States tell us about it? There's actually been a big change during the Hawke times. Before Hawke's time, the Australians had very little access. Now we have very considerable access to nominally virtually all parts of the facility. However, it's an American facility using American technology paid for by the United States. It only works as part of the American global system. They're the people who really understand exactly what it's able to do.
So Emily, what is the legal basis for the activities that take place at Pine Gap?
Well, that's a very good question, actually, Lizzie. We've been very concerned about what laws the Australian officers at Pine Gap are subject to and what advice they're getting about the laws and policies that apply to them, particularly if it's true that they're sharing information with the US that could lead to people being killed in US drone strikes. The Human Rights Law Centre has asked the government to provide information about what laws apply, and the answer that we get back is simply that everything that is done at Pine Gap is done in accordance with law. So it's really quite unsatisfactory.
So you don't know, well, I presume there are laws that dictate what actually happens. They're referring to particular laws?
They don't refer to particular laws, and whilst you can understand that the government might not want to talk about what it deems to be operational matters, we see these as quite structural things. It should be transparent what laws apply, what policies apply, particularly when you're talking about targeted killings. I mean, we have no way of testing the government's assertion that everything is lawful because we don't know what goes on and we don't know what law they're applying.
So we don't know whether it's Australian law or US law that applies at that particular base, or what law is being followed, or what the purpose of the information collection is, I suppose, as well.
That's right. There's just an unacceptable amount of secrecy around this base, and it's something that we desperately need to change.
So Pine Gap is a very contentious military intelligence base, but it's been around for a long time. Richard, what do you think it's going to be used for in the future if it continues?
Well, it's developing at a fantastic rate. It's far away from its original 1960s intention of telemetry, of monitoring telemetry from missile testing by the Soviet Union, so the Americans could know what the missiles were capable of. It now does far more than that. Almost year by year, it's physically growing. There are more antennas, more domes, the visible sign of what's there.
Do we know how many people work there?
Yes, there are about 800. It hasn't grown in numbers particularly, but like the whole IT world, it's become vastly more efficient, vastly more capable. It's now involved in missile defence. It's critical for American, Japanese missile defence activities. That's relevant to war with China, for example. We also know that its capacities for signals intelligence collection in the area that Emily was talking about, vis-a-vis drones, and that's monitoring the cell phones and satellite phones of people in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, countries with which Australia and the United States is not at war. It can hear vast amounts of material. This is all then processed, sent back to the United States. I think one important thing to understand is it's not a standalone system, part of the world. It's part of a genuinely global technological and military and intelligence system. And you have to think about the way that operates as a system as a whole. The Australian government says it operates, I think the phrase is, with the full knowledge and concurrence of the Australian government. Well, in that case, if that's actually true, and I don't actually believe it is, then the Australian government has to face up to its responsibility for the way that that data is then used in what are manifestly illegal ways in drone assassinations.
I wanted to pick up on that point. If we talk about full knowledge and concurrence, can we expect, Emily, that what the activities going on there are in compliance with Australian law?
Well, there's the initial question as to what Australian law applies. There's obviously international law that applies, and I think one of the concerns that we really have is that the sharing of this information with the US that could lead to targeted killings could itself be a violation of international law. Given that there's a lot of civilians that have been killed through the US drone program, the concern is that Australians that work at Pine Gap are actually facilitating those killings by providing information like the targets, the place where the drone's weapons need to be targeted.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back after to speak about the role of Pine Gap in the drone wars. Stay with us.